The current portrait of the West has really been getting me down. I've wanted to do a video on this for a while now, and I've talked about problem groups like Islamic radicals and Black Lives Matter in the past, but these are just facets of a greater problem. The status of Europe in particular has been digging at me. This time last year, I was telling all my stupid American progressive friends that the notion of Europe taking in hundreds of thousands of Muslim migrants without proper vetting or documentation was an awful idea, and that it would lead to very bad things. I was of course called every nasty name you might imagine. Racist, bigot, Islamophobe. Flash forward to now, and I feel a sick sort of vindication. All of the bloodshed, the sexual violence, the clashes of culture are an illustration of the fears I expressed to deaf ears. But the vindication fades when I'm met with the realization that none of this has changed anyone's mind. Saying "I told you so" is worthless when your only reward is helplessly watching a car crash in slow motion on repeat. Frau Merkel herself has recently said that Muslim migrants didn't bring terrorism to Germany. The mass rape of her own women, the killing of her own people, and the slow erosion of her own culture hasn't moved her an inch. And it leads me to believe that this is because she doesn't actually value her own culture, that the German leadership in general don't value their own culture. After all, your leftist politicians openly state that their policies will result in fewer white Germans, while claiming that this is a good thing.
Frau Präsidentin, meine Damen und Herren! Unsere Gesellschaft wird sich ändern. Unsere Stadt wird sich radikal verändern. Ich bin der Auffassung, dass wir in 20, 30 Jahren gar keine ethnischen Mehrheiten mehr haben in unserer Stadt. Das ist auch das, was Migrationsforscherinnen und Forscher sagen. Wir werden in einer Stadt leben, in der es einfach, dass unsere Stadt davon lebt, dass wir ganz viele verschiedene Ethnien haben, ganz viele Menschen, dass wir eine superkulturelle Gesellschaft haben, meine Damen und Herren. Das ist das, was wir haben werden in der Zukunft. Und ich sage Ihnen noch ganz deutlich, gerade hier in Richtung rechts:
Das ist gut so.
No room for interpretation there. Fewer ethnic Germans is good, and that is what our policies will do. Any government policy inherently carries intent behind it. Meanwhile, the media seems willing to make any excuse it possibly can for the spate of terror and the disintegration of European culture. They will happily plaster a picture of a Syrian boy caught in airstrikes everywhere for the world to see, but tried to suppress this image of a small French girl crushed to death in Nice, one of hundreds of victims in that attack alone. But doesn't this image make you glad that over 1 million Muslim migrants, most of whom weren't actually Syrian, have flooded into Europe? Don't you feel good about yourself? Does it remind you of anything? Similarly, here in America, we are faced with the specter of Black Lives Matter and their supporters, who, in the wake of the incident in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, seem to be beyond reproach. When a young black man flees a traffic stop, points a stolen firearm at a police officer, and is shot by that police officer, the response of the black community is to loot, smash, and burn down property in their own neighborhoods, and, more disturbingly, to openly target white passers-by for violence. You most likely haven't heard of the white people attacked at random, dragged from their cars, and hospitalized for the crime of being white and existing near angry black people.
If they white, if they're white, they white, get their ass! Burn that bitch up! Hey, they beating up every white person! They jumping every white person! Man, no white person come down Sherman! He white! Beat this shit! Bitch! Hey, look! White boy! They beating up every white person! They beating up every... They make the squad cars leave.
They beat somebody's ass. Look, they beat somebody's ass, y'all. Look. Look. Look, bro, look. Oh, look, y'all, look.
I feel a similar sense of vindication in the wake of this incident as well, as I've said for the past couple of years that Black Lives Matter have always been a hate movement. They have now leaked into Europe and are exhibiting similar behavior there. Just a couple of weeks ago, they torched a village in France and held a protest in the United Kingdom in which several people, including a police officer, were stabbed. The day after the incident in Milwaukee, the sister of the man shot by police issued this profound statement for the cameras.
On everything! Tell his mama y'all sorry for her loss! Burning down shit ain't gonna help nothing! Y'all burning down shit we need in our community! Take that shit to the suburbs! Burn that shit then. We need our shit. We need our weed. I don't wear it, but we need it.
CNN had the good sense to cut this clip mere milliseconds before she says, "Take that shit to the suburbs," so that they could report it as a call for peace rather than the call for violence that it was. This incident amounts to a race riot. It's akin to a small-scale reenactment of 1992 Los Angeles. A Milwaukee city alderman responded to the chain of events in this fashion.
Something has to be done here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to address these issues. The black people of Milwaukee are tired. They're tired of living under this oppression. This is their existence. This is their life. This is the life of their children. Now, what have happened tonight may have not been right. I'm not justifying that. But no one can deny the fact that there's problems, racial problems here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that have to be closely, not examined, but rectified.
And meanwhile, Senator Tim Kaine, who is Hillary Clinton's running mate, is saying things like this.
And so I've made my spiritual home in a neighborhood where we're not segregated. In fact, we were, when we started there, one of a few white families in that church. It's now a very well-integrated church, but it was important to, especially I think the burden is on those of us who are in a majority, Caucasians here.
We got to put ourselves in situations where we're in the minority.
Black Lives Matter, Islamic cultural encroachment, and violence, these are not separate problems. These problems are symptomatic of the greater politically correct narrative. There are a variety of names that we could use for it. You might call it social justice, or regressive leftism, or cultural Marxism. But what really matters here are the ideas which have led to these circumstances. The idea that the culture of the West is uniquely horrible and imperialistic. The idea that white people are uniquely oppressive and exploitative. The idea that multiculturalism should serve as atonement for the sins of our fathers, even after Frau Merkel's previous admission that multiculturalism is a failure.
Wer vor Krieg und Verfolgung zu uns flieht, der findet bei uns Schutz. Wer bei uns Zuflucht und Schutz gefunden hat, der muss unsere Gesetze, Werte und Traditionen achten. Und um uns zu verstehen, muss er die deutsche Sprache lernen. Das alles, liebe Freunde, ist Integration. Das alles ist das glatte Gegenteil von Multikulti. Es bleibt dabei, Multikulti führt in Parallelgesellschaften.
Und Multikulti bleibt damit eine Lebenslüge.
These ideas have grown in strength over the course of decades, have permeated our culture and poisoned the well. They are present in academia, in the news media, in entertainment, in the ideological positions of our politicians, and if these ideas are allowed to progress unchecked, to continue to degrade our culture and rule of law, I believe that there is a serious cause for concern over the future of Western civilization and the people who have traditionally upheld it. In the case of Europe, white Europeans, and in the case of America, any person who accepts Americanism. To be clear, my father is one of those people, and he's an Egyptian immigrant. He came to the United States of America to become American, not to demand that America should become more Egyptian. This should be the expectation of all immigrants to all Western countries, to assimilate into the host culture and accept it as theirs. Without making this demand, and without enforcing it harshly, you are setting the clock on a time bomb. Here's Vice President Joe Biden describing his vision of a Hillary Clinton presidency.
There's a second thing in that black box, an unrelenting stream of immigration. Non-stop. Folks like me who were Caucasian of European descent, for the first time in 2017, will be in an absolute minority in the United States of America. Absolute minority. Fewer than 50% of the people in America, from then and on, will be white European stock. That's not a bad thing. That's a source of our strength.
Here's a Swedish politician saying that the white majority is the problem.
Bristen på så kallat utländska svenskar i SSU och partiet som ett problem, utan att vi, den vita majoriteten, är så många. Och det är vi som måste förstå att
vi är problemet.
Och vi måste förändra vårt sätt att vara.
Here's a BBC presenter saying that the UK will never be white again and you just have to accept it.
The fact of the matter is, the UK is never going to be white again. It's just not going to happen. People can wish it, but it's not realistic. Similarly, our parents who have left Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Muslim countries, for them to think that they can re-establish those countries and the lives that they had there over here, it's not going to happen. And I recognize the fact
that that's a big loss for both people, for both sides.
But the reality is that we have to move forward. The reality is that we're together going to have to find out, what does it mean to be British moving forward? What does it mean to build a society that includes all of us, where it means looking like me and looking like you?
Her assertion that everyone can just get along and that British values will be preserved in the long term is optimistic to be charitable. I would call it naive and stupid. Although she is ex-Muslim and seems to want to uphold British values herself, she doesn't represent the average Muslim migrant. Not by any means. Even with only a small minority of Muslims, about 2 million in the UK, demands are already made to limit speech which is critical of Islam. These demands are louder in other European countries, such as France, where Muslims represent a greater demographic share of the population. Moreover, why is she even referencing the whiteness of the UK? Do white people have a different culture or something? Is she some kind of racist? Another portion of this BBC special includes an interview with a Muslim woman in a public park in which a bystander interjects in the conversation.
And it's come to the point now where I don't really think that me condemning these kind of attacks are going to change people's opinions. So if you've got something to say, then you can say it. Do you want to talk about Sharia law? You want to talk about Sharia law to me? We'll talk about Sharia law. You obviously said it for a reason.
Just look at how aggressive she is becoming and then realize that you are expected to accept this person as a moderate.
I wasn't talking to you.
Who are you talking to? Who are you talking to about Sharia law here, sir?
We're losing our right to freedom of expression. And I think...
Why is that?
Because we are.
Asking him why he thinks he doesn't have a right to freedom of expression mere moments after shouting him down about Sharia law.
We are. We're being told to be politically correct when we don't want to be politically correct.
So each of these red dots is an anti-Islamic tweet coming from the UK. And that we can see happening right now, that's a digital reaction to the Nice attacks.
Massive red mass.
That's right, angry, abusive, anti-Islamic, all happening in the immediate aftermath of Nice.
The BBC published this clip with the headline, BBC Islamophobia discussion interrupted by Islamophobia. So I suppose being against Sharia law is Islamophobic now. Here are some Muslim migrants in Norway taking a cultural attitudes course, an attempt at re-educating them into Western culture.
When they were deciding what to put in the course, they were assuming that you were going to think that the woman not wearing hijab is worthy of less respect.
She's thinking something like that, so she's wrong. I respect them.
But do you think all of the migrants think the same as you?
No, I think they think they are whore. Before some year, maybe I'm like them, but I changed.
Kamp mot islamisme, fordi islamisme og nazisme bygger på det samme totalitære systemet.
Moi is an hour from Stavanger, the city that sparked public outcry because so many rapes were linked to foreigners. Christian Vedler is from the right-wing, anti-immigration Progress Party. They're part of the current coalition government.
A couple of years ago, we had several incidents involving foreign taxi drivers from Afghanistan and some Middle Eastern as well, raping females. The men doing these sexual assaults didn't argue that they didn't understand it was unlawful. They knew what they were doing.
Do you feel that some of their values are incompatible with Norwegian culture?
Female rights in Middle East are incompatible on what our view is on female rights.
In Moi we spoke to several Syrian migrants who felt a little offended that they had to go to these classes.
They need to know that this is a different place, that females in miniskirts are only females in miniskirt and there is no invitation to do anything else. We need classes and we need them to accept that this is how we do it in Norway.
Does this guy look like some kind of jackbooted far-right monster to you? No. This is a perfectly reasonable expectation if you accept migrants at all.
Back in Moy, I met up with Swad, a single mother of 4 who came here from Qatar.
The actual Syrian guys might have been okay, but let's hear how this sounds. And remember, about 80% of the migrants who poured into Germany since last year are not Syrian.
Her asylum application has been refused. She's been appealing for 4 years. In the meantime, she's still going to the classes.
هلا أنا عم بحكي عن حالي أنا مستحيل يعني إنه مثلا إن أنا مثلا أتغير ويصير عندي يعني حرية زيادة. أولادي إنه الخطوة 1 2 3 حابب إنه هو يخطيها مسؤوليته. ولا رجل شرقي راح يتغير من درس نرويجي قاعد يسمع بيوم الخميس. مثلا أنا يجي شخص عربي يحكي معي يقول لي إنه أنت ليش لابسة هذا اللبس؟ لبسك غلط. أنت لابسة غلط. يقدر يروح هو يكلم العرب يكلم النرويجية يقولها إنه لباسك غلط ونعم تلبسين غلط. هذا راح يتغير يعني الناس تيجي بس تاخذ إقامة تقول للدرس باي باي مع السلامة.
Surely these people will integrate and everything will be just fine. We live in a world where Westerners, and specifically white Westerners, have been taught for several generations that they are guilty of a kind of original sin, that their heritage is one of shame, that their values are oppressive and wrong, that their people have no culture, and that they must atone for this however they can, by any means necessary. Combine mass immigration, the open hatred of and guilt by white Europeans and Americans, the downplaying and turning away from the use of violence against them, the fall of birth rates below replacement rate, and the open admission that sustained mass immigration will result in a white minority in the long term. It doesn't take a genius to see what's happening here. The ideologies of social justice, political correctness, and cultural Marxism have created a context in which hating the West and hating white people is not just okay, but righteous, where accepting foreign and incompatible cultures is not a question, but an obligation by way of pathological benevolence, where we are so afraid to offend, so afraid of being called racist, that the outright murder of our own is to be turned away from. I fear that the context it has been allowed to manifest will ultimately result in the fundamental destruction of Western civilization as we know it. This will not be some it's happening cataclysmic event that will occur overnight. It will be a slow, painful, bloody, dehumanizing decline. It will be the gradual corrosion of our cultures and the supplanting of them with something we know to be much worse, a sort of cultural replacement, if you will. And this doesn't have to be some grand conspiracy, something cooked up in a smoky room. Rather, it's the product of a series of bad ideas put into practice by deluded bad actors. Frau Merkel, to reference her once again, is a prime example of this. She and her policies are the product of decades of bad ideas being taught, repeated, and put into practice for the sake of false moral superiority and unchecked altruism. You might say it's crazy that this will never happen, but we wouldn't be the first. This sort of scenario has played out many times throughout history, and I'm quite sure that there were naysayers in every instance crying, "Oh, you're just crazy. That can never happen. Our society and our culture are invincible." Those societies felt quite invincible right up until they weren't. In the case of Germany, the approaching demise of the older generations will dramatically increase the demographic share of Muslim migrants. The death of elderly Germans will give migrants much greater political standing as their percentage of the general population increases. The problem can be mitigated, or even reversed, if action is taken in point of time. Personally, I am in favor of dealing harshly with cultural attitudes which prove antithetical to our own. It has been raised to me that deportation is an untenable concept, that it's too complicated, too costly, and that it might even be cheaper to keep the migrants than to eject them. Examining the situation for every individual EU member state which has accepted migrants could be an entire video in itself, but since I'm on a German's channel at the moment, let's examine Germany, shall we? Absolute numbers are difficult to pin down, and the budgetary issues are complicated, being that the migration crisis has been partially funded by German federal money and partially by state money. However, there are estimates, and averages which can be derived from those estimates. It's difficult to say what should belong to this budget and what shouldn't. This doesn't account for the cost of terror attacks and individual attacks perpetrated by migrants. It doesn't account for the cost of law enforcement and intelligence response to these incidents. It doesn't account for the economic loss of those maimed or killed in attacks who will no longer contribute to the German economy. The presently assumed average cost per refugee per year is 10,000 to 20,000 euro, which works out to around 20 billion euro annually. The German government has budgeted approximately 93 billion euro for the years 2016 through 2020. The average cost of deportation is also difficult to pin down, as it would vary from state to state. Using Bavaria, the state to have carried out the most deportations as an example, we can come to an average. Bavaria's state expenses for deportations were 2.5 million euro in the year 2015, with 1,666 deportations carried out. This gives us an average cost of 1,500 euro per deportation. So let's say for ease of argument that there are 1 million migrants in the country. Based on this average, with all other variables removed, Germany would be looking at a one-time cost of 1.5 billion euro to deport them all. Of course, it's unlikely that each and every migrant could be deported, especially all at once. This is merely meant to be an illustration of the difference in expense. It's possible that the migrants could offset the cost of providing for them if enough of them found employment. However, a report earlier this month found that the majority of migrants in Germany who have found employment were actually from before last year's large influx of migrants. Most of the employed migrants were from 2014. It's unclear how many of the latest crop of migrants have actually found employment. Kraut himself has expressed fears of the far right rising in Europe, and I think those fears are at least somewhat legitimate. But I'm quite sure of one thing. The leaders who created these problems, who look the other way from these movements, they will not be the ones to solve this. In the case of Germany, well, your federal elections are coming in 2017, and I hope for your sake that you elect leaders better than Merkel and her East German cronies. In my opinion, it's no longer such a matter of left versus right. Kraut and I have discussed this together in the past. The line between the two has begun to blur. Rather, I see this as a matter of pragmatism versus idealism, nationalism versus internationalism. Do you want to put your country and its people first or not? Do you want to act in your own interests or not? Do you have pride in your culture, your heritage, your values, or not? Perhaps I'm just one of these crazy alt-right folks, nothing more than a fearmonger making some kind of fallacious slippery slope argument, but that's the fun bit about slippery slope. The only sure way to confirm if it's slippery or just a slope is to wait and see what happens. And when it's a question this big, is that a risk you're willing to take? Long ago, Coptic Egyptians lost the right to their self-determination and lost the right to their homeland. And now there are almost none of them left. It's way too far gone for me to do anything about it or for them to do anything about it, but when I talk to Europeans and I ask them, don't you care if there are people like you in 100, 200, 300 years? Does that matter to you or not? Maybe it's a strange question, but as much as we Americans and Europeans make fun of each other, I feel a connection to Europe. We're family. My other half is Anglo. White Americans are the descendants of Europeans. When I look at Europe from over here and I see all these things happening, I feel sick. I don't know how to describe it. But I know the average European didn't really choose this. Your leaders did. Merkel is a coward. She sits in her ivory tower, moves around with security, and doesn't have to feel the effects of her policies. She doesn't know the position that the average German is in. She doesn't see her own women being raped in the street. She's never attended a child marriage. She's never witnessed a German stabbed or shot or hacked apart. She doesn't have to deal with any of it. Just like Obama. Just as much of a moral coward. He'll sit there smiling for the cameras with Black Lives Matter organizers while police officers are shot and entire neighborhoods burned to the ground. This is the portrait of modern Western leadership. Cowardice, opportunism, and unaccountability. And I, for one, am fucking sick of it. I'll leave you with this. A message from the President of the Czech Republic.
A tak v zahraniční politice je jenom jediná temná skvrna. A tou je migrační vlna. Politici, kteří zavírají oči před tím, že se k nám tato migrační vlna ještě nepřelila a že se proto není čeho obávat, mi trochu připomínají jednoho bývalého pražského primátora. Tento primátor v době povodní stál na mostě a říkal, situace je nadmíru výtečná. A 2 hodiny poté voda zalila pražské metro. Někdy si připadám jako Kassandra, která varuje před vtažením trojského koně do města, ale jsem hluboce přesvědčen o tom, že to, čemu čelíme, je organizovaná invaze a nikoli spontánní pohyb uprchlíků. Ti, kdo se zastávají imigrantů, mluví o soucitu a solidaritě. Soucit je možný u starých, nemocných a především u dětí. Ale velká většina nelegálních migrantů jsou mladí, zdraví muži bez rodin. A já se ptám, proč tito muži nevezmou do ruky zbraň a nebojují za svobodu své země proti islámskému státu. Jejich útěk objektivně posiluje islámský stát. A já si nedovedu představit, že v době, kdy z protektorátu prchali naši mladí muži, prchali proto, aby ve Velké Británii dostávali sociální dávky. Prchali proto, aby bojovali za svobodu své země. A totéž samozřejmě platí i pro ty, kdo odcházejí ze zemí, kde se nebojuje. Protože jejich odchod odsuzuje tyto země k další zaostalosti. Když se připravovala demonstrace zastánců migrace k 17. listopadu, tak jsem od jedné z našich zpravodajských služeb dostal informaci, že na transparentu této demonstrace má být nápis "Tahle země není naše, refugees welcome". Potom někdo poradil těmto organizátorům, že ten nápis je mimořádně hloupý, a tak ho nahradili o něco méně hloupým nápisem "Tahle země patří všem, refugees welcome". A závěrem svého vánočního poselství bych vám chtěl říci dvě jasné věty. Tahle země je naše. A tahle země není a ani nemůže být pro všechny. Milí přátelé, šťastný a veselý nový rok.
Hey there, Europa, please hold on just a bit longer. Every day I learn so much about your past and I grow fonder, yes I do. We'll soon make history for you. You'll know it's all because of you. Hey there, Europa, here's to you. This one's for you. Oh, you're up for Europeans. Oh, Europe is all we have. Oh, you're up for Europeans. Oh, Europe is all we have. Oh, you're up for Europeans. Oh, Europe is all we have. Oh, you're up for Europeans. Oh, Europe is all we have. Europe is all we have.